For most people in Boston, the main story from Tuesday's primary election is the historic and not so expected victory for City Councilor Ayanna Pressley. Her decisive win over a 10-term incumbent, Congressman Mike Capuano, is widely viewed as one more extension of a national trend. But if politics is viral, it's still very local, except that the Boston electorate has dramatically changed over the last 30 years. To share some insights and impressions is the executive editor of CommonWealth magazine, Michael Jonas. Thank you very much for being with us, Michael.
Good to be here, Chris.
I want to start with you, because you had a post about this in a way, the sense of how this electorate in Boston has changed since, let's say, 1986. How would you sum that up?
Well, I think, and you mentioned that there's been talk about the races, especially the congressional race, being nationalized, that this was really part of a national wave, that this race fit within more than sort of particulars of our region. And I think that's true to an extent. I think that you're right, though, it is still very local. I think the one thing that's different is that what you mean by local, or who are the local Boston voters, is a very different demographic. It's a different group than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And in that sense, I sort of think that the local electorate has itself become sort of nationalized, if you will, in the sense that I think that the voters of Boston, are much less a population of people who are steeped in the history, who've grown up here. And I think they, and in some ways it's a perfect sort of bridge to it, much like Ayanna Pressley herself, who grew up in Chicago and came here, that a lot of the electorate here is made up of people, who may have spent their first 20 years or 25 years somewhere else. They very much make Boston now their home, but they don't have the same kind of attachments to, sort of time-honored political traditions, or this idea of always kind of leaning toward a homegrown candidate, which, that used to be a very powerful force in local elections at one time.
Well, I was looking at the numbers in South Boston, where Steve Lynch easily won re-election, and there was no vote for Ayanna or Capuano. The turnout on Tuesday was about 20%, which is below citywide average. In Ward 19, Jamaica Plain, a little bit of Rosendale, it was 40%, which is well above the average. So, what does that say about the flavor of our vote?
I think it goes to the same point that, South Boston, a neighborhood we associate with sort of entrenched longtime residents, is not really the South Boston of old anymore. And in a way, there's kind of several waves of newcomers. So South Boston, really, if anyone's driven through there recently, you see condos popping up all over in, what the old timers used to call the lower end, closer to Broadway Station. So those are real newcomers to Boston. And I think what's interesting is that in places like Ward 19, folks who we might sort of think of as newcomers, in the sense that you're not really a true Bostonian unless your grandparent was born here, they're not really that new anymore. Again, these are people who've been here maybe 20 or 30 years. So they're not native to Boston, but I think by that kind of turnout and engagement in that race, you can see those are people that have become very vested in local politics.
You were at the celebration for Ayanna Pressley on Tuesday night. Just looking at the people in the room, what was your impression?
I think the first thing you have to come away from that with, well, two things. One, it was a young crowd, and it was very diverse. And so I think that, that tells you a lot about what fueled her win. And I was at an event last night where one of Ayanna Pressley's chief campaign strategists spoke, and he said also that they were looking at, just anecdotally, he was at polling places. He made an interesting comparison. He said during the presidential race 2 years ago, there were people talking about in certain precincts, maybe not so much in Massachusetts, people were coming in who seemed a little confused about where to vote for the first time. And these were places where Trump saw a big surge of people coming out to vote for him. He saw the same thing in a precinct in Brighton where there were young people arriving on bicycles, locking up their bikes. You can get the profile of the person we're talking about, and they were unsure where's the entrance for the polling place. And as he saw that unfolding during the day, he was feeling very good about his candidate, Ayanna Pressley, against Mike Capuano.
By the way, did you find this result surprising?
I was frankly surprised. I'd love to say, I was among those who saw it coming, and certainly this margin, I think it was about 18 points. It's just an astounding margin of victory for her. So I think, like a lot of people hedging their bets, I thought she might pull it off, and if she did, it would probably be by a pretty thin margin. So I think this was this was more than just kind of a coin flip and it landed on her side. This was a pretty resounding voice or vote of confidence in her. And again, I know we're all trying to be a little polite. I don't want to say it's a rejection of Mike Capuano personally, but I think it's a rejection of this sense that we ought to keep people in just because they've been there for a long time. And to borrow a line that I found very powerful, I read in one of the national articles written about this race, of which there were many in the last few weeks. I believe this was in U.S. News and World Report, and they said that Ayanna Pressley is running an aggressive campaign against Mike Capuano, although she has not really identified a fireable offense that he's committed. And I think that's the thing that's really, that made this victory so powerful, is that, in fact, nobody really did think he'd committed a fireable offense. And in the past, that would almost be a guarantee of re-election. I mean, you're the status quo, the one in office, and the default is going to be to stick with you. And yet, in this case, people didn't need a fireable offense. It was enough to say, we're ready for a generational change. I think, although she, tread very carefully on the line around identity politics, there's no doubt that I think people were excited about the idea of sending a woman to Congress. I think people were excited about the idea of sending an African-American woman to Congress. I think that made a difference.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Michael Jonas from CommonWealth magazine. It's also a stark contrast from last year's race for mayor between Tito Jackson and Marty Walsh. What was so different with Ayanna is that even long before the primary election, she had people coming out to back her. I didn't see that with Tito last year. And I know these are two different candidates, but it shows me there's a different phenomenon here, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. And I don't know what to say other than that you can't generalize too much, and you take each election on the terms that it comes at you. I don't think that, another point that's been made is that Ayanna Pressley, as much as she was part of this wave of change, she was not sort of an insurgent candidate in the sense that people talk about people running who are kind of aligned with the Bernie Sanders movement. I mean, she's very much been a political insider. She worked for members of our own congressional delegation for many years before herself running for office. And she's kind of played the inside game. I mean, Tito Jackson was very clear from the outset about this being kind of a rattle the cages outside insurgent campaign. So I think he, his sort of base that he started from was kind of a smaller population of voters in the city that were kind of responsive to that kind of a message. She had a lot of sort of more established Democratic voices that were willing to get on board with her.
Turning to the race for district attorney, a lot of people were surprised that Rachel Rollins won this. In my case, because maybe she didn't have nearly as much money as Greg Henning. Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised. And again, I'd say I was as much surprised by the margin as by the actual outcome. I thought going into the sort of final days that the race was really going to be, it was between Rachel Rollins or Greg Henning. I thought they were the only two with a real path to victory here. But I thought if she did pull it off, it would be, again, by a slim margin. And she did much more than that. And I think, what a lot of people had talked about, and I wrote about it, was that you had several progressive candidates, you had several candidates of color competing in a 5-way primary. And I think a lot of people just kind of did the math and said this is favoring the one candidate who sort of stands apart from the others as being much more the candidate of the kind of law and order establishment. And I always thought, he's not going to get a majority, but I thought he'll get enough to win the race. Now,
the other thing that's remarkable about this primary is that we had 2 local state representatives who were part of the leadership team in the House, and they were defeated, one of them by a wide margin, by in Rushton's case. But what do you see going on with these 2 races? Nika Edelgardo defeating Jeff Sanchez?
Yeah, these were in some ways, these had a lot to do with what happens on Beacon Hill, I think. I don't think that, Jeff Sanchez was, asleep at the switch and not present in the neighborhood. It wasn't that, that he seemed out of touch with constituents or not present. There was a dynamic at play there that was going to be very difficult for him, which was that, Sanchez was appointed a year ago to be the Ways and Means chairman. in charge of writing the state budget, one of the most powerful positions up there. Normally, that would be a real feather in anyone's hat, and most constituents would see it as a real bonus that their rep is in this powerful position. But it really was more of a double-edged sword or a mixed blessing for Jeff Sanchez, because he's got a powerful position in the one chamber of the legislature that's seen as more conservative, even though he represents one of the most liberal districts in the state. And the House is seen as a place that has been sort of a barrier to some progressive legislation. And so it put him in a difficult position where he had to either kind of champion sort of aggressively some of the issues that folks in his district wanted and sort of buck the speaker who's put him in charge, or he was going to disappoint people in his district. I think that's really what it came down to. He tried to sort of straddle that divide and thread the needle, and tried and had some other people speaking up on his behalf to say, you know, you want a guy like Jeff, kind of a progressive voice from a city neighborhood there with a seat at the table. He is pushing the ball down, you know, the field, but, you know, everything doesn't happen overnight. He said to me once, giving that kind of wizened, you know, you have to understand kind of how things work and change is slow. But it didn't, you know, it wasn't enough for folks in that district. They didn't buy it, I think, and they felt like in this back and forth, they and he were the ones kind of getting used, and they weren't able to use this position he had to advance their interests.
He won precincts that had a Latinx population from where he grew up in the district. He carried the part of the district where he lives now, this sort of upper middle class, very stable Jamaica Hills area. But the rest of it, you have this sort of younger area, more transplants maybe. And is this maybe a generational thing that's going on too?
I mean, I think again in that race there was a real, you know, young flavor to the supporters for Nika Elegardo, but I don't think it was exclusively that. I know there were a lot of sort of activists in their 40s or 50s in Jamaica Plain who got behind her as well. But I think it is an interesting. There was an interesting divide in that district that he, in some ways, was still favored by, you might say, sort of the older, some of the old guard residents, and certainly the sort of Latino precincts were you know, sort of stayed loyal to him, and they may have been less concerned with, I mean, there were issues around how the legislature handled energy, renewable energy legislation and things like that, that some of the real kind of go-getter climate activists in these other sections of the district, you know, really cared a lot about, and those may have mattered less to other folks. There, in those areas, you were hearing talk about him delivering money for this youth center in Jackson Square. So there were kind of really competing views on what it is people were looking for from their rep and what was important to them.
What I also think it changed the way these candidates engage their voters. Just this week, you know, before the primary, we see all these ads on television for Greg Henning, and he finishes a distant second. And then you turn to Presley. The only television ad she bought was on Univision in Spanish, and she's communicating with people through all these different channels. You know, Rachel Rollins wasn't running TV ads, at least not money. So,
no.
Are we in a new era with this now?
I think that's a really fascinating wrinkle in this race. And again, this event I mentioned earlier that I was at last night with one of Ayanna Pressley's chief strategists, and he talked a lot about that they kind of made a bet that the TV ads weren't going to be a really useful way to spend their limited resources. They put it into field operations and other things. He said that he wasn't 100% sure whether that was the right bet. They now felt like it really was, and it may be that this serves as kind of a playbook for some races going forward. I mean, the other thing I would just say is that I felt like Henning was running sort of a totally different race than the others, and from his point of view, and from, it might not have been the worst strategy, because frankly, you know, his base of vote was going to be an older, whiter, more conservative slice of the electorate. And those are people that are watching more TV and may have seen those ads. I think that for Presley and the demographic she was targeting, you know, those people aren't watching television. So I think over time we may see a shift and less, you know, advertising through TV. But I think that disconnect doesn't mean that one of them kind of got it and the other didn't. It almost sort of underlines the point that they were appealing to very different sort of worlds within the local electorate.
Because the other thing, between the support by police officers for him and from all the assistant prosecutors in Dan Connolly's office, did he maybe saddle himself with looking too much like the incumbent when people wanted something different?
I think that in the end, I mean, hindsight's 2020. I think you'd have to say that that was not a winning formula. I mean, again, I think you kind of go with the hand you're dealt in a way, and so I'm not sure. I haven't talked to people in his campaign. I don't know, in their Monday morning quarterbacking, if they're thinking they would have done things differently. I'm not sure you would have, because again, there were kind of different lanes available in this race, and I don't know whether if he had sort of put a little more sort of distance between himself and that law enforcement establishment, would he have had the ability to make some inroads among other kind of swaths of the electorate or not. There were a lot of pretty strong, eloquent reform voices in the race competing for those votes. So I think they made a decision at some point, again, that they were going to win this thing, not really with a kind of broad city or county-wide mandate, but by finding those pockets of places where they could cobble together enough to just edge their way past their closest competitor. So,
and I know before Monday morning, I thought the reformers' vote was going to be splintered. Thank you very much. Michael Jonas from CommonWealth Magazine.